Welcome to Understanding Wildfire with Professor Monks. Today's topic, Fire History, Part 2. The United States and Australia provide an interesting set of comparisons and contrasts in the history of how fire was managed. Though located on opposite sides of the Earth, they share many similarities. Both are large countries, both had a long history of indigenous inhabitation prior to European colonialism, both were British settler colonies who later achieved independence, and both have become industrialized economies with high average material standard of living. However, the two countries have taken notably different paths in their history of fire management. The fire history of the United States begins with indigenous fire practices. Across what would later become the U.S., native people burned the landscape for a variety of reasons: to encourage the growth of desirable plants, to drive game toward hunters, to clear travel routes, to reduce the hazards of major fires, to control insects, to attack enemies during war, and other reasons. Early European explorers often noted the clear understory and ease of travel through the forest created by native burning. Native people, and with them native fire practices, were forced off their land by white settlers. Some of these white settlers developed their own traditional fire practices, such as burning stubble from fields or controlled burns to prevent major wildfires in southern pine forests. But in many places, this frontier settlement brought with it huge and destructive fires. The expansion of white settlement westward across the U.S. was driven by the growing industrial economy of the 1700s and 1800s, which required large amounts of resources extracted from western lands. Industrial-scale logging of forests left large amounts of dried-out branches and leaves, known as slash. A spark from a passing train could ignite this slash and cause a major fire. This was the case for what was likely the largest wildfire in U.S. history, the Peshtigo Fire of 1871. The Peshtigo Fire ravaged both sides of Green Bay in Wisconsin, burning through almost 500,000 hectares of heavily logged forest and killing between 1,500 and 2,500 people. At the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, the federal government started taking a more active role in managing undeveloped lands in the U.S., especially in the West. This is the time period when we see the establishment of the national parks in 1872, the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, and eventually the Bureau of Land Management in 1946. A major influence on fire management was Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the Forest Service. Pinchot believed that natural resources like forests should be managed to produce the most benefit for the most people for the longest time. He was thus opposed to destructive, unsustainable logging and mining that was going on across the country. He wanted to conserve the nation's resources for future generations. Pinchot studied forestry in Germany, where major fires are rare and forests are often more like tree plantations in between densely settled towns. Applying these German ideas to American forests, he believed that fire was always destructive. Trees that burn can't be logged and made into something useful. He thus pushed for a policy of complete fire suppression. Fire suppression was difficult to pull off across the enormous, sparsely populated lands managed by the Forest Service until two major historical events provided new resources: the Great Depression and World War II. The Great Depression began with the crash of the stock market in 1929. Huge numbers of people lost their jobs and were unable to find new work. With no money to spend, they couldn't buy stuff, and so businesses couldn't make a profit by selling things, and so they couldn't hire new workers, and so on. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt came into office in 1932, one of his major promises was to put Americans back to work on government projects in order to get the economy going again. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, a program that provided jobs building public works to unemployed men, and it was for men, since men were viewed as the proper breadwinners for their families. Fire control and suppression was one project that many Civilian Conservation Corps workers were given. This extra labor helped make fire suppression a reality. In 1935, the Forest Service established the so-called 10 a.m. policy. This policy held that any fire that was detected ought to be put out by 10 a.m. the following day. The 10 a.m. policy has become iconic of the fire suppression attitude prevalent in the first half of the century. While many fires fought by the Forest Service were started by lightning, others were ignited by human activity. In order to educate the public and encourage them to cooperate in fire suppression, in 1944, the Forest Service introduced Smokey Bear. Note that his name is Smokey Bear, not Smokey the Bear. Smokey's iconic slogan, "Only you can prevent forest fires," was introduced 3 years later. A black bear cub found after a fire in New Mexico in 1950 was dubbed the real Smokey and was taken to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. But contrary to popular belief, the character of Smokey predated the finding of the cub. According to surveys, Smokey has become one of the most recognizable characters in American culture. When the economy recovered after World War II, the country no longer had masses of unemployed people put to work on fire suppression. But we had something else: military surplus equipment. The government had built huge numbers of bomber planes and helicopters to fight against Germany and Japan, which were no longer needed. The Forest Service and other agencies were able to acquire them cheaply and use them to watch for new fires and to deliver water and people to sites where a fire had started. It's in this area that we see the first smoke jumpers, firefighters who parachute from a plane into a remote location where a fire has started in order to quickly extinguish it. The policy of fire suppression was implemented nationwide from the 1930s through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But by the 1970s, it was increasingly being questioned by many people. First, ecologists studying fire had begun to identify many ways that plants and ecosystems in different parts of the country were adapted to fire and even depended on certain fire regimes. Second, fire suppression was becoming increasingly difficult. When fires are suppressed, fuel is not consumed, but instead builds up on the forest floor. Forests choked with growth became more and more hazardous, with fires harder and harder to stop. And finally, there was a strong civil rights movement emerging among Native people, demanding the right to practice their own culture and control their own lands, including traditional fire practices. Starting in the 1980s, we thus see cautious efforts by agencies like the Forest Service and national parks to reintroduce fire into our nation's landscapes for fuel reduction and ecological benefits. Sometimes this involved allowing naturally occurring fires to continue burning as long as they were far away from people and other assets, a policy sometimes called wildland fire use. Other times, it involved deliberately lighting fires under controlled conditions, known as controlled burning or prescribed fire. One of the first prominent examples of wildland fire use occurred in Yellowstone National Park in 1988. The fire burned much more widely than intended, consuming many important tourist areas of the park, and at the time, it was seen as an ecological and public relations disaster. But in the years since, ecologists have documented the positive benefits of the 1988 fires for restoring forest regimes in the park. In 2000, a controlled burn being conducted near the Los Alamos Nuclear Research Laboratory in New Mexico got out of control, leading to a major fire and questions about how well controlled a controlled burn is, though it must be noted that thousands of burns are carried out safely and without incident every year. In the 1990s through 2010s, we have seen the growing prominence of two important phenomena that have come to shape fire management in the contemporary era, both of which we will look at in more detail in future videos. First is the growth of the wildland-urban interface, or WUI. The WUI consists of housing that abuts fire-prone landscape. A growing WUI puts more people in danger and complicates fire management. For example, it's harder to do a prescribed burn when it's going to affect your neighbor's air quality. Second is climate change. The past 2 decades have seen repeated record-breaking hot years, which have helped to stoke large and destructive fires. Any fire management strategy needs to take climate change into account.